For nearly 70 years, the Soviet Union stood as one of the most powerful nations on Earth. It possessed thousands of nuclear weapons. It controlled an enormous territory stretching across 11 time zones. And it challenged the United States in a global struggle that had defined an entire era. But in December 1991, something extraordinary happened. In just a matter of days, the Soviet Union disappeared. No invasion, no nuclear war, no army marching on Moscow. Instead, a superpower collapsed from within. And at the center of it all was one extraordinary question. How does a country that once terrified the world simply cease to exist? This is the story of the final days of the Soviet Union. The 10 days that changed the world. To understand the Soviet Union's collapse, we first have to understand its power. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the world's two great superpowers. On one side stood the United States. On the other, the Soviet Union. For decades, the two competed for influence across the planet. They built enormous nuclear arsenals. They fought through proxy wars. They competed in space. And they divided Europe between two opposing political systems. But beneath the image of strength, the Soviet system was developing serious problems. Its centrally planned economy struggled to keep pace with the West. Consumer goods were often scarce. The government spent enormous resources maintaining the military and its global influence. And across the Soviet republics, nationalist movements were becoming increasingly powerful. The empire still looked strong, but the foundations were weakening. Then, in 1985, a new leader rose to power. Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike many of his predecessors, Gorbachev understood that the Soviet system needed major reform. He introduced two words that would become famous around the world: Perestroika, restructuring, and Glasnost, openness. His goal was not to destroy the Soviet Union. It was to save it. But reform came with a dangerous side effect. Once people were allowed to speak more freely, they began asking questions. Why was the economy failing? Why were political freedoms so limited? Why should Moscow control so many different nations and peoples? And perhaps most dangerously, why should the Soviet republics remain part of the Union at all? Gorbachev had opened a door. He would soon discover that he could not control what came through it. By 1989, the Soviet grip over Eastern Europe was collapsing. One communist government after another began to fall. And then came the moment that symbolized the end of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall came down. For decades, the Soviet Union had maintained enormous influence over Eastern Europe. Now, that influence was disappearing. And Gorbachev chose not to send the Soviet military to crush the revolutions. The consequences were enormous. The Cold War was ending. But inside the Soviet Union itself, the crisis was only beginning. Across the 15 Soviet republics, independence movements were gaining strength. The Baltic states wanted freedom. Ukraine was demanding greater sovereignty. Other republics were increasingly asserting control over their own affairs. The Soviet Union was no longer moving as one country. It was beginning to pull itself apart. By 1991, the Soviet Union was in deep crisis. Gorbachev was losing political control. The economy was struggling. Nationalist movements were spreading. And a new political figure was rising: Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin was the leader of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. And unlike Gorbachev, he was increasingly willing to challenge the Soviet central government itself. The conflict was no longer simply between the Soviet Union and the West. The battle was now happening inside the Soviet system. And then, everything exploded. On August 19, 1991, hardline communist officials attempted to seize control of the Soviet government. Their target was Gorbachev. The coup leaders claimed that the country was in crisis. But their real goal was clear: stop the reforms, restore central authority, prevent the Soviet Union from breaking apart. Tanks entered Moscow. The world watched. For a moment, It appeared that the Soviet Union might be returning to the old days. But the coup did not go according to plan. Boris Yeltsin emerged as the face of resistance. Standing on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament, he called on the people to oppose the coup. The image became one of the defining photographs of the end of the Soviet era. The coup collapsed after only a few days. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the damage had already been done. The Communist Party had lost much of its authority, and Boris Yeltsin had become dramatically more powerful. The Soviet Union had survived the coup, but it would not survive the year. After the failed coup, the Soviet Union began collapsing at extraordinary speed. Republic after republic declared. If you enjoyed this journey through history, subscribe for more stories about the moments that changed our world. Because history doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes, it happens in just 10 days.